Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the covenant ceremony that's described in Genesis chapter 15 in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Genesis 15:1, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me since I am childless?" Now, Abram has just been given a promise of God that God says, I'm with you. And Abram says, well, if you're with me, there's a problem here. What will you give me since I'm childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Now, God had promised Abram that he would have an heir, that he would have a son, that through his seed they would be greatly multiplied. And so far, he doesn't have any children. And the heir of his house, the one who, if he dies, is going to get the inheritance, is his chief steward, Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, "Since you have given me no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir," this Eliezer of Damascus. Previously, you would have thought, well, maybe Lot was going to be that heir, because Sarai is barren, so previously you might have thought, well, Lot's the potential heir, but Lot had now separated from Abram, so he's not the heir. Now it's possibly this Eliezer of Damascus as a potential heir. Abram's asking, is that what you mean? It's not. Genesis chapter 15, verse 4, "Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This man will not be your heir," this Eliezer of Damascus, nothing against him, but he's not going to be the heir, "but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir." Not just a spiritual seed, but Abram is going to be a physical seed as well, one from your body. And so it's not Lot, it's not Eliezer. One from Abram's own body is going to be his heir. "And he took him," that is, God took Abram outside and said, "Now look toward the heavens and count the stars if you are able to count them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." You go out into the night sky, and nowadays, with all the city glare, it's hard to see much. But just imagine just stars upon stars upon stars, and that's how your descendants are going to be. And then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. Abram believes God, and God does something. He takes his faith, and he treats him, because of his faith, as though he is righteous. And he said to him, verses 7 and 8, "And God said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it." He said, "O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it?" Abram's saying, how am I going to know this is really going to take place? So far I don't have any of the land. I'm in the land, but none of it belongs to me. How am I going to know? So he said to him, this is God speaking, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon." And he brought all these to him and cut them in two and laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. The birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Now what's happening is a covenant ceremony. This covenant ceremony is something with which Abraham would have been very familiar. You didn't make a covenant back then. You always cut a covenant. And the way that looked, you would take an animal or several animals, and you would take the animals, kill them, and then cut them into two parts and lay each side opposite the other in perhaps sort of a row. And then the parties that are entering into the covenant would pass between the pieces of the dead animal. And what you were saying when you made that covenant, you were binding yourself by life or by death to the promises of that covenant. And you're saying, if I don't keep the terms of this covenant, may what happened to those animals, they were torn apart, they were killed, may that happen to me. So in effect, you're putting a curse on yourself if you break the covenant. Verse 12, "Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram." This reminds us a little bit of how a deep sleep had fallen upon Adam, and a rib had been taken and a woman had been made. Now a deep sleep falls upon Abram. He's not going to have a woman. He's going to have God himself, who comes and makes a covenant, cuts a covenant with him. "And behold, a terror and a great darkness fell upon him. It reminds us a little bit, and we connected that back when we were talking about Adam. We connected that to Jesus, who also had a deep sleep. He actually died, and from his side was taken this injury, and there's a sense in which we see, just like Adam, we had a rib taken from Adam and the flesh clothes thereof, and a bride was taken. And in the case of Jesus, he had a spear thrust into his side. He died on the cross for us so that we could come forth. And Abram now has a deep sleep upon him, and behold, a terror and a great darkness falls upon him. God said to Abram, know for certain, God gives him promises now, in the midst of this deep sleep, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. That's some bad news, but the good news follows it. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. He's telling Abram the promise of what would happen with the Israelites going into Egypt for 400 years, and then how they would eventually come out of Egypt. There would be bad news followed by the good news. Just like in the cross, there's bad news where Jesus died for us. Good news, he came up from the grave, and he gives us life as well. The promise continues, verse 15, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. And then in the fourth generation, they will return here. That is, those Israelites will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. You see, God's going to use Israel eventually to judge the Amorite, the Canaanite, the people that are living in the land, but not yet, because they haven't finished sinning yet. He's patiently waiting for the proper time, and then it's all going to come together at just the right time. So here's the promise to Abraham. He's still called Abram so far, but if I slip and call him Abraham, you know who I'm talking about. He'll be buried at a good old age, and then his descendants are going to be strangers in the land that is not their own, speaking of the sojourn in Egypt, and then God's going to judge that land, and in the fourth generation they will return here. The reason why is because the iniquity of the Amorites isn't filled up yet. It's growing, it's getting there, but it's not quite ready. So that's all going to work together at just the right time. Verse 17, it came about when the sun had set that it was very dark. And behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between the pieces. Now we get the idea that, Abram as he's still called then, Abram had set up the covenant ceremony, but now it's God himself, the presence of God as symbolized by this smoking oven, this flaming torch that passes between the pieces, and God ratifies this covenant. God goes through the covenant ceremony, putting a curse upon himself if he does not keep his promises. And yet notice, it doesn't say the presence of God passed between the pieces. What it says is that a smoking oven and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. And the question comes up, why is that particular description used instead of it just saying the presence of God? Why a smoking oven and a flaming torch? To answer that, we have to put ourselves into the sandals of those who were reading the story, not Abram, but the ones who were reading the story for the first time. That's Moses writing for the Israelites who've come out of Egypt. And when those Israelites hear of a smoking oven and a flaming torch, you see, they're in the wilderness and they are following, if it's daytime, they're following a smoking oven, a pillar of smoke, and if it's nighttime, there's a flaming torch, and that's the presence of God among them, and that presence of God is promising, I'm going to bring you back into the land at just the right time. God is giving his promise to his people to this generation. Now on that day, verse 18, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite and the Kenizzite and the Cadmonite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Rephaim and Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgasite and the Jebusite, all the peoples that were living in the land. It's their land right now, but it's going to be Abram's land and the land of Abram's descendants. And when we read that this land would be from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, what I've just described is the land over which Solomon will exercise control. That is, in the days of Solomon, we read that from the river of Egypt, from the Red Sea in the south, the river of Egypt in the west, to the river Euphrates, that's the extent of Solomon's domain in his day.